Hello, today I'm going to summarize the book named Pedagogy of the Oppressed, written by Paulo Freire. Summary of the book, Chapter 1. Pedagogy of the Oppressed discusses systems of oppression and ways that oppressed people can liberate themselves. Paulo Freire called oppression, humankind's a central problem. People's lives take one of two tracks: dehumanization or humanization. Humanization, or the process of becoming fully human, is every person's destiny. People who are dehumanized or viewed as objects rather than individuals find themselves in this position as a result of unjust order rather than destiny. The most important job of oppressed people is to overcome their situation by transforming society. Oppressed people should be wary of the false generosity of their oppressors. To show their power, oppressors must always have someone weaker than them who needs generosity. True generosity comes from fighting the causes that lead to the oppression. When fighting for liberation, oppressed people must be careful not to become oppressors themselves and should strive to restore humanity by rebalancing society. Oppressed people often don't know how it means to be fully human. Their ideal is to be man, but for them, to be man is to be oppressors. Oppressed people don't seek to be liberated. They seek to be the polar opposite of what they are now. Rather than oppressed, they become oppressors. This model liberates no one and perpetuates oppression. People cannot truly be seen as human until they are free of perspective behavior of the oppressor. To gain their fully humanity, the oppressed must first identity or name the situations that oppress them. Then they should demand change. Many oppressed people have a fear of freedom because of the risk of themselves and the others in their community who potentially face greater oppression. The oppressed will not fight back until an entire community bands together with the same yearning. Oppressed people suffer from the duality of knowing that without freedom they cannot exist authentically, but simultaneously fear an authentic existence. The oppressed should be in charge of seeking their own liberation, and in Pedagogy of the Oppressed, Freire outlines a method for identifying ways to seek freedom. Liberation should come in two forms: objective, an actual change in power structure, and subjective, a change in the way people see society. This duality can only be achieved through praxis, a combination of reflection and action, in which the oppressed must confront reality critically and demand action based on that reality. The best method for engaging oppressed people in the pedagogy is through dialogue, presented as education programs rather than systematic education, which requires political power, of which the oppressed have none. The pedagogy itself has two stages. In the first stage, the oppressed unveil the world of oppression and commit themselves to its change. In the second stage, the oppressed begin the process of permanent liberation. In other words, in the first stage, the pedagogy helps the oppressed change their perception of the world. In the second stage, the pedagogy helps dispel the myths that created oppression in the first place. Freire explores the consciousness of oppressors and the oppressed to help explain the pedagogy's necessity. For oppressors, money and having is more important than humanity. Humanity is a thing, and they possess it as an exclusive right. Oppressors do not recognize their monopoly as the privilege which dehumanizes others and themselves. Often they see those with less as incompetent and lazy. If the oppressed appear ungrateful for the generosity shown by the oppressive class or envious, they are perceived as enemies who must be watched. The more the oppressors control the oppressed, the less human the oppressed appear. The very act of oppression, Freire argues, is violent because it prevents the oppressed from being fully human. The oppressed could not exist without the violence of oppression. Yet, when they fight back against their oppressors, the oppressed are often labeled as violent themselves. The fight for liberation should be seen as an act of love, because it restores humanity to the oppressed as well as oppressors. However, Freire notes that when oppression has been destroyed and new social rules have been created, most oppressors will themselves feel oppressed. Oppressors have become so accustomed to power that any restriction to their previous way of life appears as a profound violation of their individual rights. For the oppressor, the only right is their right to live in peace, without recognizing that for the oppressed, the only right is the right to survive. Freire cites the myth of divine order as one explanation of the docility found in oppressed people. Presents, for example, believe their presence because God ordained them to be so. As a result, the oppressed are more likely to act out in horizontal violence against each other than against their oppressor. At the same time, they feel an irresistible attraction to their oppressor's way of life. The oppressed distrust themselves and their knowledge because they aren't the professors who have been given the power to speak their knowledge as truth. Internalization of the negative views propagandized by the oppressors fuels this distrust and creates a necrophilic mindset that causes the oppressed to destroy their own lives. In order to fight back against their oppression, the oppressed must first recognize their humanity and the method of domination that reduced them to things: propaganda, management, and manipulation. In doing so, they must also engage those around them in conversation. Allies in power, the revolutionary leadership, should also engage in the pedagogical discussion of change, trusting the oppressed to manage their own liberation. Analysis of Chapter 1. While Freire wrote in response to his work with oppressed people in Brazil, his concept can easily be transferred to groups and societies around the world. Oppression happens everywhere, every day, and is symptomatic of unjust social structure that benefits some groups while harming others. Oppressors take two forms: active oppressors like policymakers who knowingly exploit their workers, and passive oppressors. like people who benefit from our oppression system but don't actively violate humanity. Consider civil rights era America, for example. Active oppressors would be the government leader writing Jim Crow laws to keep races separate, or police officers who harass or abuse black citizens during protests. Passive oppressors would be the white people who enjoyed living in the best neighborhoods, having the best jobs, going to the best schools, and receiving in the best health care, while their black neighbors were not entitled to the same access. These white people, whether they recognize the injustice or not, benefited from an oppressive society, even though they didn't write or carry out the oppressive laws. On the other hand, passive oppressors are particularly interesting because they encompass the largest percentage of a population. Many passive oppressors don't realize that they are perpetuating someone else's suffering, and often when they become enlightened to their role, want to help those they are oppressed. However, many oppressors turn alliance unknowingly carry oppressive mindset. They believe that since they are better educated, wealthier, or more experienced than the oppressed group, they know better how to rise the unfortunate out of oppression. They use their political power to sway or change law. They generously give to organizations created to help lift oppressed groups out of the poverty. They may even offer an oppressed person a job, scholarship, or money to change their situation. But to Freire, none of these solutions are enough. Welfare gifts are an example of false generosity. False generosity gives the oppressor the feeling of making a change, being a better person, or transforming someone else's life. But in reality, they are perpetuating oppression. Passive oppressors need unfortunates to save. If there were no oppressed people to save, they wouldn't have an opportunity to bestow generosity. The severe are not interested in changing the system that created oppression and allowed them to passively benefit. If they actually revolutionized society to eradicate oppression, they would lose power. Freire argues that even kind-hearted, well-intentioned people do not want to lose their ability to live peacefully. For this reason, oppressed people should be in charge of identifying what oppresses them, demanding change and transforming society. Members of the majority, oppressors who choose to align with the oppressed, can help but should not take charge of any aspect of liberation. The problem with oppression is that it prevents a certain group of people from embracing their full potential. When people are held back, Freire argues that it prevents them from becoming fully human, which is each person's divine destiny. When people fail to become fully human, they are dehumanized or objectified. This means they are seen as objects rather than individuals. Business owners, for example, often view their employees as workers rather than individuals. Bosses create policies to maximize their profit without considering how these policies affect their workers. They may expect long hours and offer low pay, knowing they are simply replace workers who fail to meet their demands. They don't consider or care how policies affect individual workers. Those workers are treated more like objects than humans. They are viewed as interchangeable parts to be replaced as easily as cogs in wheels, Freire notes that often the oppressed will only fight against the oppressors when they join together with the same yearning. For example, one embittered employee might not risk his job to demand better working conditions or pay, But if all the workers join together and go on strike until their demands are met, they will have a better chance of transforming their work environment. Oppressors will not hand over their power unless forced. So, Freire's ideas are revolutionary because they completely rewrite what social change look like. For most people, there are two groups, those with power, those without power. The problem Freire identifies is that when people without power suddenly gain it, they become just as oppressive as the group before them. Freire gives the example of a peasant promoted to the overseer position, but it might be just as easy to consider a school where one student is promoted to hall monitor. Often that students becomes a bully because he or she has been given power over the rest of the students. The student wants to prove that he is better than the other students and that he is deserving of the promotion. In Freire Revolution, there aren't two sides. Instead, there's dialogue, which redistributes power equally, creating justice and opportunity for everyone. Chapter 2 Summary. In Chapter 2, Freire turns his lens on the relationship between teachers and students. He describes teachers as narrators who lecture students, whom he describes as listening objects. In this relationship, the teacher is viewed as knowledgeable and the student is as ignorant. The student is essentially a vessel to be filled with the static, compartmentalized, predictable knowledge deemed useful by the teacher. The student simply accepts the knowledge and regurgitates it when needed without ever truly understanding what it means. In this way, the education system dehumanizes the student. The classroom mirrors oppressive society in that the teacher holds all the power and makes all the choices, while the students are never consulted and must comply with the teacher's choices. This method of education, which Freire calls the banking method, views students as malleable creatures expected to be subservient to their teacher's power. In the classroom, they learn the passivity they will take into the world. This serves the oppressors who care neither to have the world revealed nor to see it transformed. Oppressors use the banking method of education alongside paternalistic social welfare programs that perpetuate the idea that those struggling, either in school or life, are easy, stupid, or incompetent. They must be re-educated by the oppressors in order to be integrated into society. Freire argues that the correct way to handle outsiders is not to integrate or re-educate them, but to change the system so the outsiders become beings for themselves. Freire acknowledges that many teachers are unaware that their banking method of teaching promotes oppression. He also states that some students may become aware in their studies that this education model clashes with their ability to become thinking beings for themselves. Teachers shouldn't wait for students to make this realization. They should engage students in active discussion about the world rather than simply teaching studies or simply teaching students how to fit in it. Likewise, teachers should engage with students in an equal quest for humanization rather than imposing guidelines, restrictions, and measurements on learning. A teacher cannot impose his or her thinking on a student, just as he or she cannot fully understand a student's thinking. True thinking, Freire argues, that comes only through dialogue, which is living and rooted in an ever-changing reality. Students within the banking system of education partake in an educational experience that not only promotes their oppression but also the death of their humanity. To combat this, many identify with charismatic leaders they view as virile and active, when they should be exploring the virility of their own humanity. Banking education systems simply cannot be used in the pursuit of liberation. Its use negates the possibility. Instead, Freire suggests problem-posing education, which involves open discussion between the teacher and students. In problem-posing education, there is no authority of knowledge. Everyone learns from each other by speaking and learning. Speaking or listening. Students are no longer docile listeners, but co-investigators in dialogue. Problem-posing education works because students are posed questions that relate to their own experiences. As they answer this question, they further engage with and question the world. People develop their power to perceive critically the way they exist in the world, because problem-posing education views reality as constantly changing, in process, in transformation. It likewise affirms as man or woman as beings in the process of becoming. The idea of transformation and change are at the core of problem-posing education. Through discussion, the oppressed gain deeper understanding not only of history, but also of their place in history. This gives them deeper understanding of how to transform society and end oppression. It engages people as beings aware of their incompletion. Analysis. This chapter dispels the argument that hierarchies are the best way to organize society. Traditionally, groups of people are organized under a leadership, whether in a business, school, church, or family. One person or a small group of people make the rules and everyone else follows them. Those at the top are considered to be the best, the strongest, or the smartest. In the polarized worldview, that automatically means that those on the other end of the pole, those lowest down in the hierarchy, must be there because they are lazy or ignorant. To maintain this polarized hierarchy, oppressors propagandize information, perpetuating the myth that only those in charge hold truth. Consider a university classroom. Students sit with pencils and notebooks in hand, diligently taking notes on whatever the professor says or teacher says. Because exams, they memorize exactly what the professor or teacher said, and during testing it back onto the page. Often, those whose answer most closely reflect the professor's teachings get the highest grade. The banking method of teaching objectifies students by casting them as empty vessels that need to be filled with someone else's thoughts before they have any value. This method also perpetuates the myth that only the professor, the top of the hierarchy, holds knowledge of truth. Knowledge or truth. The professor bestows information on the students who would be completely ignorant without it. Freire argues that all people are innately intelligent, and he gives the example of an uneducated peasant who comes to relatively same philosophical rationale as the famous existentialist Jean-Paul Sartre. Both men, Freire asserts, have the natural capability to understand the world. The mythology perpetuated by oppressors, however, suggests that only the successful, educated philosopher holds the truth. The oppressors create a false dichotomy between traditionally educated and uneducated people, which results in the continued oppression of the uneducated. These dichotomies don't need to be remodeled by, for example, giving power to more oppressed people. Rather, Freire believes the hierarchy must be destroyed altogether. This can only happen when people educate each other as equals. The first step toward educating as equals is for the oppressed people to name the world. If the peasant from Freire's example were to listen to a lecture by Sartre, he would be completely lost. He would have no idea what Sartre was talking about because he wouldn't understand the educated man's language and terminology. However, if Sartre and the peasant were to dialogue, listening to each other as equal, the peasant would be able to express himself using language from his unique viewpoint. Although the peasant is uneducated, his views would educate Sartre because they would give him a completely different view of the same ideas. So, moving the idea of respectful dialogue to the arena of oppressed societies, Freire argues that if the oppressed are able to identify the reasons for the oppression by naming the world using relevant language, they will be able to dialogue with revolutionary leaders about how to enact change. Teachers or revolutionary leaders might want to engage discussion participants in deeper understanding of the issues, and to do so, Freire suggests problem posing. Problem posing engages the oppressed in discussion by asking open-ended questions about relatable subjects. In the problem-posing method, all participants of a discussion are considered equally valuable. This method humanizes learners and creates an environment capable of bypassing the oppression. Chapter 3 Summary. Freire continues his argument about the importance of discussion by describing what makes words important: reflection and action. Words lose their power if used in only one dimension and not the other. Words without reflection are activism, and words without action are verbiage. Only when words are spoken in both dimensions can people change the world. For the world to change, all people must be allowed to speak their truth. They cannot speak for or represent another. Meaningful dialogue cannot happen by dispositing or consuming ideas, nor by imposing one's truth or another. For Freire, dialogue is an act of creation, firmly rooted in love. Dialogue is the process of naming the world, and by trusting others, particularly those deemed weaker. To explore and name their experiences is an act of love for both humanity and the world itself. It is also an act of humility. People cannot dialogue if they think they know better than anyone else, or deserve to have a wealthier option. Dialogue only works when both parties arrive seeking to know more than they do now. Finally, dialogue is also an act of faith. Faith that people can accept a rewritten or renamed reality. Both parties must trust the other through a process of reflection and action, just like words in dialogue. Trust is built when people say what they mean and follow through with their action. Equally important in Good dialogue is hope. Dialogue cannot happen in hopelessness. People can continue fighting and be patient for change when they still have hope. Hopelessness breeds silence, and in it, dialogue feels tedious because people do not believe their words will amount of anything. Any teachers present their students with topics they are already interested in or that already affect their lives. Students don't feel like they need to be changed, which is an oppressive feeling. Instead, they feel like they can change the world, which is a liberating feeling. In order to engage with oppressed people, educators and politicians must use language the people can understand. Otherwise, the people will be alienated. They must also discuss the problems vocalized by the oppressed people, not the problems the educator sees in the lives of oppressed people. Through the use of generative themes, people are able to reflect on their own actions and their place within the world. Freire described how this ability differentiates humans from animals. Animals simply survive, living in the moment without reflection. Animals live in a submerged reality, lacking a past or future. In contrast, humans inhabit space physically and historically. They consider their place in history and have the opportunity to change the future. Humans have the ability of creativity in material goods, systems, and ideas, whereas animals are bound to the reality of their existence without the possibility of transformation. Freire divided history into epochs, periods of time in which particular themes, ideas, or problems are relevant. Each theme resides in a thematic universe, that engages the past, present, and future. So a particular theme is never isolated within one time period. Each theme is a result of the past and bears influence on the future. Oppressed people often fail to recognize how their problems or themes were created or how they can change their situation for a better future. The oppressor who benefit from the oppressed ignorance rarely help them understand. Education provides the opportunity for thematic investigation or the discussion of a particular theme throughout time. A teacher might present a worldly example of a theme to oppressed students. By decoding the image of oppression, the students will better understand their own. Freire argues that educators and students become co-investigators in the theme because the theme is not an object. It's relationship between people and time. The process of decoding helps students create a worldview and to understand their place in history so they can change their future. Freire wants educators to avoid focusing the discussion on the students themselves as the risk further objectifying them. During discussion, the teacher should allow for the interconnectedness of thematic discussion and should avoid a conversation that has an itinerary, which suppresses free thought and restricts understanding of total reality. So Freire breaks down his method of engaging students and educators by giving an example of illiterate peasant village. If educators wanted to help liberate the peasants, they should first call a meeting to discuss their aims with the peasant and enlist a group of volunteers to help them with their research. Then they should spend time observing every aspect of the peasants' lives and recording them in notebooks. Not they should call another meeting and ask the peasants which conditions have the greatest impact on their lives and whether they are aware of the limit situation that have held them back from changing those conditions. Then educators should present worldly images that are relatable to the peasants and ask the peasants to discuss the images without the educators projecting their own viewpoint. In this way, the educators can identify how their worldview differs from that of the peasants. Once educators have decoded the important themes in the community, they can work together to create an educational program. The thematics which have come from the people are returned to them as problems to be solved. Analysis. In this chapter, Freire defines dialogue and describes its benefits. Dialogue presents the perfect opportunity for praxis, the process of reflection and action. In Freire pedagogy, praxis is the key element to social change, and it's only made possible through dialogue. Dialogue differs from straightforward conversation. It involves mutual respect, understanding, and love. In Freire's definition of dialogue, each person's contributions must be viewed as equally valid. There is no leader or professor of facts. Each person's opinion should be accepted as truth. Open dialogue is integral to Freire's pedagogy because it creates hope. When oppressed people have hope that their situation can change or that oppression isn't permanent, they are more likely to engage in revolution and find patience for the fight. To create open dialogue, revolutionary leaders and participants must be speaking the same language. As discussed in the previous chapter, if revolutionary leaders use language that people don't understand or discuss theories that seem relevant to the participant lives, the participants will be less likely to engage. The conversation would feel oppressive because the participants would feel like they needed to change. To engage participant in the conversation, Freire outlines the process of naming and decoding the world. Both processes involve the use of images to understand broader themes, broader mind. Through the naming process, leaders or teachers engage participants in open-ended discussion about their living situation. Steering the conversation without dictating and listening carefully to what participants say, leaders will gain a clear picture to the issues participants feel are of most important to their lives. Interestingly, Freire's method of engaging participants in dialogue involves a long time period of research and observation before opening a discussion. This observation period is crucial in creating trust. Oppressed people will likely be wary of accepting outside help, particularly if that help is coming from the member of the dominant elite. Freire urges leaders, teachers to foster trust with their participants, including trust that the oppressed people can liberate themselves. Freire describes many ways of building trust, such as nominating members within a community to act as volunteers, but in regard to the pedagogy, trust is the communication is most important. First, leaders must show that they respect the people. This means respecting differing opinions as equally valid. Second, leaders' action must back up their words. If revolutionary leaders make a promise, they must follow up or risk alienating the people. It is only when leaders have successfully observed the people, named their themes, and earned their respect that they can open the dialogue to change. Pedagogy of the Oppressed, Chapter 4 Summary. The book's final chapter is concerned with the revolutionary praxis, or the process of actually liberating oppressed people. As always, Freire reminds government leaders to allow the oppressed people autonomy over their liberation rather than pushing their own agendas. Revolutionary praxis is a unity, and the leaders cannot treat the oppressed as their possession. Leaders who fail to utilize dialogue with oppressed people are either totally misguided in their role or are actually dominators in disguise. Revolutionaries that attempt change for the people might as well be attempting change without the people. As always, the best way to ensure liberation is through dialogue. If leaders cannot trust the people to carry out the revolution, there's no point to liberation at all. Leaders must view oppressed people as their equals in communication, whether through critical thinking or action. Praxis of the leaders and the people should be happening simultaneously, not one before the other. Many dominant elites fear communication with the people because they fear losing control. As oppressors, dominant elites don't want people to think for themselves. Freire describes the differences between oppressive power and revolutionary power, essentially suggesting that revolutionary leaders are motivated by liberating humanity, and oppressive leaders are motivated by suppressing humanity. Revolutionary leaders must be particularly careful not to buy into oppressive myth of the people's ignorance and allow the people's voices to be heard. Even though they are leader, their opinion is not the true word. The road of revolution, Freire argues, is eminently educational in character, hence the pedagogy. He defines anti-dialogic tools used by pressure and the dialogic tools revolutionary leaders can use to overcome them. The first four tools defined are the anti-dialogic tools used by oppressor. Contrast. Anti-dialogic individuals, oppressors, seek to conquer or control others. The first step in conquering a group of people is to prevent their free thought and dialogue. Oppressors achieve this by mythologizing the world and presenting false facts to the people through propaganda and slogans. Freire lists a variety of these myths, including the myth of the universal right of education, the myth of the equality of all individuals, and the myth of the generosity of the elites. Divide and rule. When a minority group is in power, it often divides the majority and pits them against each other, thus ensuring the majority will not unifying against them. Historically, the minority has used any means necessary to ensure this division, including violence. One common practice of division is focalized views of problem. Leaders divide large areas into local communities and focus each community attention on themselves. On the surface, this appears to benefit the community by strengthening it within itself. But it actually intensifies alienation by preventing small communities from seeing the totality of their larger region and country. The same can be said of leadership training courses, which promote individual success rather than the success of entire community. Leaders often return from their training courses with tools to control their community rather than liberate it. Manipulation. Manipulation begins when an oppressed people is conquered and continues as long as the dominant elite maintain control. Often, oppressed people don't know they are being manipulated through propaganda and other means. Sometimes the manipulation can even look like dialogue, as with treats or agreements. Therefore, they use any tactic available, including physical violence, from developing class consciousness. Freire warns of populist leaders and welfare systems which appear to benefit the people, but are actually manipulation that perpetuate oppression. Culturally, invasion. The final anti-dialogic tool Freire discussed is cultural invasion, is in which oppressors insert themselves into the culture of the oppressed, often under the rouge of being a helpful friend, and changes the way oppressed people view themselves. The oppressors align the oppressed views with their own. By alienating oppressed people from their culture, the oppressors ensure their cultural practices are viewed as superior. Superior. So oppressed people will want to talk, dress, and talk like their oppressors. Cultural invasion also occurs in classroom and home, where children are often pressured not to think for themselves and to simply accept what authority tells them. This lesson is enforced when the children grow up and fear freedom as adults, becoming oppressed workers and citizens. To combat this, revolutionary leaders should invite participants to reform society through dialogical cultural action. Freire differentiated between a city that has been modernized and developed, saying modernization often comes from the outside, but development comes from the inside. Purely modernization reforms do not benefit a society because their understanding of oppression has not changed. The next 4 tools are designed for revolutionary leaders to overcome the anti-dialogic tools of the oppressors. Number 1, cooperation. In dialogic action, participants meet to name their society as well as their problems and action-based solutions. One group does not dominate, everyone works together. This does not mean there are no leaders. Leaders do not own the people and may not steer the people blindly towards their salvation. In order to create true cooperation, revolutionary leaders must earn the trust of oppressed people. Once they have trust, they will have the free coincidence of choices. To earn trust, and revolutionary leaders must genuinely believe in the potential of the oppressed people. In trusting the people, the revolutionary leaders march with the people, truly becoming part of their society rather than an outsider objectifying them. Number 2, unity for liberation. While the dominant elite tried to divide oppressed people, revolutionary leaders should attempt to unify them whenever possible. This can be difficult because unification cannot happen without praxis. It is much easier to divide people than to unify them. Before people can be part of a unified, oppressed class, they must first recognize themselves as oppressed individuals, which can be a difficult message to understand under the umbrella of the compelling mythologies propagandized by the oppressors. Number 3, organization. Once revolutionary leaders have achieved unity among oppressed people, they can organize the larger group to change their circumstances. To do this, leaders must witness to the people that struggle of liberation is a common task. To witness properly to the people, leaders must be deep understanding of the historical contrast of the struggle, the world views held by the people, and the principal contradiction of their society. True organization happens when revolutionary leaders work with the people to change society by transforming their reality. Number 4, cultural synthesis. Cultural synthesis operates as the direct opposite of cultural invasion. Whereas cultural invasion attempts to separate people from their culture, cultural synthesis returns them to it. It also attempts to unify different cultures by recognizing the sameness between them. It encourages groups to learn from different culture rather than to teach people from different culture. Freire gives the example of workers demanding a high salary. It would not be enough for revolutionary leaders to simply join the fight. They should help the workers understand why their salaries are so low and to join them with other low-paid workers to change the reality of their oppression. Analysis of Chapter 4. In the final chapter, Freire described how leaders can put his pedagogy into action to help oppressed people liberate themselves. He identifies 4 key tools of oppression and then counters with 4 tools revolutionary leaders can use to overcome them. As Freire discussed in previous chapter, the easiest way to control people by controlling their minds. If people don't think for themselves, they accept whatever reality oppressors present to them. By controlling their minds, Oppressors conquer the people and reduce them to objects that can be controlled. Freire suggests that giving oppressed people the tools to name their world, casting of the reality created by the oppressor, is the first step toward ensuring their liberation. By reclaiming their thoughts and autonomy, oppressed people have a choice in their future. They needn't accept the methodologies promoted through propaganda. They are free to think for themselves. The only way a revolutionary leader can engage participants in cooperation is by earning their trust. Freire uses Argentinian Marxist revolutionary Che Guevara to support the ideas of communion and transformation. If Guevars have not truly loved and been loyal to the peasant, Freire notes he would have chose to be a leader and emerge as a dominator. Oppressors further alienate the oppressed by separating them, ensuring they stay fragmented and therefore weak. Recalling the idea of divide providence, Freire notes how oppressors use propaganda and mental conquest to keep small groups submissive. A tenement of 30 peasants isn't going to revolt against their government. Each individual is more likely to think, I'm just a lowly peasant. What can I accomplish? However, if that small tenement were to join forces with other tenements around the country, and suddenly the number of revolutionary peasants swells from 30 to thousands, that same peasant might think that there's chance for change. This mentality is exactly what oppressors hope to squash by dividing the oppressed. Modern readers needn't look far, for example, for how divide and conquer works. Politics provides a great example of the tool. As long as Republicans and Democrats cling to their own terminology and viewing politics as a polarized areas, you are one thing or another. A small group of leaders makes the decision and blames the fallout on the masses with the propaganda like if Democrats would only or Republicans always. As long as the people remain divided and pitted against each other, there's no hope for changing the way government operates. Manipulation. Manipulation is the term for the thought control referred in Freire's description of conquest. Manipulation is particularly insidious because it doesn't always appear sinister. Often a pressure appears to be engaging in dialogue or striking compromises when they are actually manipulating the oppressed back into submission. This can clearly be seen in contract and treaties that are signed but ignored. Consider Native American, for example. At various times in history, the U.S. government has signed agreements promising protections for indigenous people, but the government rarely honors their side. The Standing Rock protest of 2016 illustrates how powerful governments ignored the rights and requests of minority people. The government attempt to build an oil pipeline through a protected tribal water supply. Government treaties give oppressed people and their allies the impression of dialogue. That the government appears to be listening and responding to the oppressed population's need. When they fail to honor their agreement, however, they lose the trust of people. Freire outlines ways for revolutionary leaders to act in contrast with the manipulative government. Leaders should be consistency between their words and actions, boldness to confront risk, radicalization that leads to action, courage to love the oppressed, and faith in the people. Cultural invasion rewrites an oppressed people's culture by making the oppressor's culture look superior. This happens regularly during colonization. Consider, for example, British colonialism in India. When the British colonized, they set up schools where students learned to speak English and accept doctrines of Protestant Christianity. Indian citizens began adopting British mannerism, fashion, and aspirations. Even now, Indians who speak English with a posh accent are considered more desirable than Indians who have the exact same education and who speak the exact same word with an Indian accent. Cultural invasion erases in native culture and creates a culture of oppression because native people feel like they have to change in order to have value. The setup automatically makes oppressors socially superior. By making the oppressed want to be like them, the oppressors secured their position of power. In cultural invasion, oppressed people are told what's best, the best way to speak, dress, or act, rather than deciding for themselves. Interestingly, Freire described the same tactics being used to oppress children in homes and schooling, suggesting that traditionally home life, in which parents are the authority, stems from oppressive tactics learned long ago and passed down through generations. Oppressed children grow up to be oppressive parents, just as peasant becomes a violent overseer. The oppressed become oppressors. Freire tried to break the cycle in the all relationship through dialogue. If parents understand their children's needs, for example, and are able to communicate their way, parents won't feel the need to dictate every aspect of their children's life. Freire offers hope that through dialogue, two opposing views, whether parent and children or government and citizens, can be synthesized into one cohesive plan for the future. Thank you so much